and the last of the mailbags for this marathon mailbag session today. Um, Remember, mailbags are questions and comments you guys leave on the channel. We do our humble best to try and answer those questions and comments, or we start a debate. But before we get going, remember, normal parish notices apply. If you haven't subscribed, why not? The subscribe button is there. Hit the subscribe button. If you want to be notified when new content arrives on the channel, that's what the bell icon is for. Go click the bell icon. If you want to help support how this channel operates and the videos and the equipment that this channel demonstrates and talks about and go over to Patreon, support me over there, www.patreon.com/themusictechguy. The address is down here. Now, we are still in the midst of lockdown, so COVID-19 is still something. Remember, stay at home, stay safe, wash the hands, and don't do anything different until Boris says that we have to change. So the first one in this last section of the mailbag is from a channel commentator, Gary. So Gary Robinson says, "Hey mate, hope you're good. Sorry I've not been commenting for a while. Been insanely short on time thanks to lockdown. I'm now splitting my time between trying to make music and looking after my kids who are basically going insane for lack of school. Very interesting about the MX-1 and its support for the USB devices made by other manufacturers. I wonder if there is a list of devices out there that have been confirmed as compatible. Have found a small bug in my UK MX-1 recently, which occurs from time to time. Now and again I switch it on and there is absolutely no bass on the audio signal whatsoever. I found that just simply powering it off and powering it back on, it seems to fix the issue." And this is in response to MX-1 USB support video I did on a mailbag in April 2020. So, at the bottom line is, family and health come first. So the fact that you haven't commented, well, there are other people commenting, so don't think that they're not taking your slack up. You know what I mean. In terms of MX-1 support for other manufacturers' equipment, do you know what? I've not seen anything. There is nothing. No, I've not seen any information circulating in any of the user groups where people have actually said they have a fully supportable device with the MX-1. The only list I kind of know of is in the firmware release notes, and it's not a list. It's not a list in terms of it. So you have to read each one of the release notes to find out which additional pieces of Roland equipment that the MX-1 now supports if you implement that particular firmware. So sorry on that one. It's just a very interesting situation that I think will develop. Especially if Roland can come up with something like the MX-2, which they probably need to now. All the boutiques are in play. More interesting is reading the issue you have with the MX-1. And I suppose what we really should remember is the ARIA equipment, the boutique equipment, effectively is software driven. So that basically means there is a certain set of logic in there. So there'll be a certain set of DNA converters and a certain set of outputs, etc., etc. But really, how the machine itself works is all driven by the software that you load onto it, or should I say, Roland load onto it. Which is probably why you're seeing this issue, because I don't think you see this issue if it was a hardware-driven device, because the hardware logic would ensure the signal is the same every single time, unless you have a hardware failure in there, of course. Which is sort of what you're describing is a software fault because it's transient. So something hasn't loaded, switch it off, switch it back on, that thing then loads, and the device operates as you think it should operate. But I suppose the first thing is, have you reported it to Roland? Are they going to fix it? But I have to be honest and say we haven't seen any firmware updates to the MX-1 for quite a period of time now. People have been reporting restricted supplies on the MX-1 for quite a long while. So in reality, do we think a new firmware version is going to be released anytime soon? Well, you know what? Your guess is as good as mine. Next one is from Michael Walls, and he says, I have another question I would like to ask concerning a problem both Gary Deathbeats and I have concerning recording master effects on Mixdown in Logic Pro X. I tried to resolve this by routing to channels 17 and 18, but I still can get the master effects recorded on the Mixdown. What am I doing wrong? So I'm going to assume that what you're trying to do at this point is you're trying to take your signal out of lockdown, route it to 17 and 18, and then put the effects on the MX-1 before you then record it to something. That's what I'm assuming you're trying to do here. And if I am correct, then I should say before this is all about the mailbag dump to computer MX-1 alternative video I did in February 2020. So going back to that, if my assumption is correct, and my reading of the circuit diagram, the routing diagram that Roland issued, because they were having so many questions about this, I would say that it is coming back in after the effects. So if you read the diagram, the way I read the diagram is the signal is coming back in after effects. So if you want to put effects onto that signal and you're in external mode, then you'll have to put the effects on the signal in the door, because the signal will come back in after effect on the MX-1. That's kind of how I read that. And the second question or comment you made is, incidentally, I've replaced my boutiques with the Jupiter XM. I would be really interested to know what you think of the Jupiter XM. I really would, and there is a reason why I really would be interested to know what you think of the Jupiter XM. The next one comes from Dr. X. Any relation to Dr. Mix? And he asks, so how does the MIDIVerb sound? This was an SMR I did a long time ago, 2016. I bought the MIDIVerb, yes. MIDIVerb 4 was a rant I did in 2016, March 2016. And so, and this question has actually been floating around for quite a while. And the reason I didn't answer it was because I was expecting to do a video on the MIDIVerb, and I haven't got around to it because of my time commitments. And what I would say about the MIDIVerb is that it is brilliant for working live scenarios. If you want to put effects onto a keyboard and play live, or play in some sort of live style environment, the MIDIVerb is really, really good. What I have found with the MIDIVerb, though, is some of the effects it puts onto the signal in processing actually makes the signal quite noisy, and therefore I would say that if you were looking to the MIDIVerb for recording, it might not be the best unit, depending on what effects you're putting onto the signal, of course. For recording, it puts like sort of high bandwidth noise onto the signal quite often. That's what I found. I do use it for recording, so don't get me wrong, and I use it an awful lot with things like the DX7 and D50 to add the effects that the keyboards themselves aren't able to add to the signal. But from a recording point of view, I think there's probably better processors out there for doing what you want to do. And the final one for this extended mailbag session that I've been doing this afternoon is from Tom Keys, and this is in response to the Korg T1 Restoring the Factory Sounds from Disc video I did in September 2017. Another very popular video, I might add. And Tom writes, I have disc but keep getting disc error message. I've also tried using MIDI OX and I get the buffer error. Any help would be greatly appreciated. So I'm going to start with all these sort of problem diagnostics. It's very difficult to diagnose some things on sort of very light information, and that's no disrespect to anybody raising a question on the channel, I might add, because what I'm here to do is stimulate the thought process I might not be able to give you the answer, but at least if I stimulate a thought process, you go through that thought process and then come back to the channel, hopefully, and say, I solved it by doing X. Anyway, I'll start with the disk issue. What you haven't said in the comment is whether you're getting this on all disks or just specific disks. And the reason why I need to make that distinction, because if you're getting it on all disks, that's a pretty good indication you've got a problem with your disk drive, because none of your disks are loaded, or all your disks have been subject to the same problem. So one of the things I see musicians do all the time, and I think quite often think to myself, that's going to cause you a problem at some point, is they tend to put things like they put the disk on top of the disk. So I can't show you at the moment, but if the disk drive was like that in the machine and there was like a slot on top, quite often musicians will put the disks on top of the disk drive. Now, at the end of the day, there's not a lot of magnetism going along, but remember, these things are magnetically charged, and therefore you have a magnet or an electromagnet in that disk drive that is pulsing electromagnetic bits onto the disk drive. Now, if that's goes a bit rogue and starts producing errant magnetic charges, then it's possible that it could corrupt the disk that's sitting on top of the disk drive. All right, so there's that, and we're all guilty of doing this, right? And the other thing I see really often in sort of home studio setups is people putting discs on top of loudspeakers. And guess what, guys? In that loudspeaker, there is a thumping great big magnet, because that's how the speaker works. And you're putting your magnetic media on top of a speaker with a thumping great big magnet on it. Don't do it. Anyway, that's the reason why I ask. So the question is, are all disks failing or some? If some disks are failing, that's probably not an indication that the disk drive is on its way out, although the disk drive still could be on its way out. But it could be that you've got corrupted disk. Okay, so you probably need to think about getting some media from somewhere else and sorting that out. So I can't answer which way is the right course of action for you, because, to be honest, I don't know. But if it's a disk issue, get some new media. If it's a disk drive issue, I think you're onto the user groups and eBay looking for a replacement disk drive for the T1. And they are getting a bit scarce, but there are people out there that have the appropriate electronic knowledge to actually make a modern machine, a modern disk drive, work with your older machine. And that's what this is. This is a modern disk drive, a more modern disk drive than is in my SY85, but it's been modified to work with the SY85, and that will be going in shortly. So moving on to the buffer error. So the key thing to remember about the Korg T1 is the fact that it is a relatively old machine, and therefore you have to treat it as such, and make sure that you're only throwing data down to the machine at the rate the machine can consume it. And a buffer error would typically indicate that you're either throwing the data down too slow. Yes, you can throw the data down too slow, or you're throwing the data down too fast. So what I would do is I go and look at the video I did on backing up the T1 video, T1 files to your computer, because in that video, about 3 minutes in, I talk about the speed settings for use with the T1. So what the upload speed and the download speed for a T1 are, or the settings I use. And I have never had, since I've installed those settings in MIDIOX, I've never had an issue with dumping SYSEX backwards and forwards. The other thing to look at as well is, are you trying to do this through a big MIDI interface, as in, supports lots of devices off your MIDI interface, or are you trying to do it through a dedicated small MIDI interface? Now, I've said many times, I've probably said it a couple of times this afternoon when I've been recording mailbags, is that I have a MIDI Sport 2 in, 2 out, and I use, every time I do SYSEX dumps backwards and forwards, I use that device religiously because it works.